Good afternoon. Welcome to the third Keynote Lecture titled Decolonizing the Academy, Trans-Indigenous Possibilities by Dr. Katrina Teaiwa of the Australian National University. My name is Lorenzana, and I'm pleased to introduce our speaker. Dr. Katrina Teaiwa is Associate Professor in Pacific Studies and Deputy Director, Higher Degree Research Training in the School of Culture, History and Language, College of Asia and the Pacific of the Australian National University. She's an award-winning educator, author of Consuming Ocean Island, Stories of People and Phosphate from Banaba, and a visual artist touring Project Banaba in Australia and Aotearoa, New Zealand. Katrina's teaching and research methods combine ethnography, storytelling, dance, film, and textual and visual archival approaches. Katrina has been Vice President of the Australian Association for Pacific Studies since 2017 and was previously AAPS President. Please welcome Dr. Teaiwa.
Thank you so much for that lovely welcome. Kamna Maori and Nisa Mbulavinaka to all of you. I hope you've been having a wonderful conference. I'm sorry I haven't been able to join otherwise, but thank you for inviting me to present today. So I'm coming to you from Canberra, where I work at the Australian National University, as mentioned, and I'm coming to you from the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people. So I just want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the unceded lands that I live and work on. In our protocol, we also ask that you acknowledge the traditional owners or the indigenous peoples of the lands that you're gathered on as well. So today I'm going to give maybe more of an informal presentation and, just have a bit of a chat, talk about a project that I've been involved in the School of Culture, History and Language at the ANU, a project which I think is very relevant to the theme of your conference. And I'll also talk a little bit about my own work as I introduce myself a bit more and how my work took us on this journey to the film that we will screen as well. Could I just double check that you have the link to that film? And if not, I will add it into the chat now. I'm presuming everyone can see the chat. Is that correct?
Yes, you can. Yeah, we see you.
Okay. So I will put the link into the chat, and there's a couple of ways you can watch it. You can watch it on YouTube, or you can watch it directly on our website. So this is the first link, which is the YouTube link. And then another way you can watch it is via our Decolonial Possibilities website. And I'll talk a little bit more about the website a bit later. Okay, so I'll prompt you when to go to those links. But first, I'm going to attempt to screen share, and you let me know how that goes.
Yes, yes, please.
Okay. Let me know if that's coming through okay.
Yes, not yet.
Still cannot see anything.
Yeah.
Okay, there might just be a little lag, and then we'll see how we go. If for some reason the screen sharing doesn't work at all, I'm going to reduce my introduction, and then we'll just move straight into the film. But I wanted to, because I'm an academic and a visual artist as well, I was hoping to show you a few images from the kind of work that I do.
Katrina.
Okay, is it showing it?
No, I think, let me just check with Ido if whether he has downloaded the movie, because he can actually stream it for you if he has it. Our technician.
Oh, okay. But at the moment, I'm just showing my PowerPoint.
Okay, then.
PowerPoint is not showing?
Yes, I could see the
we
PowerPoint.
see it now. We see it now. It has come
Okay,
through.
wonderful.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, just a little bit of a lag coming from Australia. Okay, so I was very interested in the topic of your conference because colonization and decolonization are themes that are quite prominent in my work and in interdisciplinary Pacific Island studies where I'm located. And I have a PhD in anthropology, but maybe kind of a bit of an ambivalent relationship with anthropology, particularly because of its intersections with colonialism in the Pacific, where I come from. And the Pacific is one of those places where many anthropologists have studied so many societies and cultures and created quite a lot of knowledge and different branches of anthropology on the basis of their research, particularly in Melanesia and Polynesia. And a lot of American anthropologists as well have done quite a bit of work in Northern Oceania, which is a bit closer to the Philippines, which I know has a close relationship and sort of a lot of historical similarities with experiences of colonialism in Micronesia. For example, having with places like Guam, for example, being colonized by Spain, and then creating like a contemporary culture, which is a mixture of all of these different influences over time. So this map that I'm showing, I always start with a map to locate myself and to position myself. I work in a very multi-sided way because I was born in Fiji. So there's a little yellow triangle in Fiji, but our people come from Kiribati, which is in the center of the Pacific. So we are one of those displaced Pacific Islanders who are moved from their home island in Kiribati, and the home island is called Banaba, and it's somewhere over here near Nauru. So our people were moved from there in 1945 to Fiji as a result of phosphate mining. And that phosphate mining very much destroyed a good portion of the island. The island is only 6 square kilometers. So it's a very small island, but our people had lived there for thousands of years. So even though it's such a small island, the Banaban people were very resilient, and they had very much figured out how to live within the limitations of the flora and the fauna on Banaba. So ancestrally, I'm connected to Kiribati, where the Gilbert Islands and Barnaba are. So both my grandparents on my father's side are from there. And that is the heritage that we acknowledge in Fiji, where we were moved as a minority community. So we are a small community who are indigenous to the Pacific, but not indigenous to Fiji. And there are about 6,000 Banabans today. So when we arrived in Fiji in 1945, there was only about just over 700 of us left after mining and after World War II, because the Japanese targeted our island for occupation because of the mines, because they wanted to be able to do some of the mining themselves. And then after the war and a period of time spent in World War II camps, there are only about just over 700 Banabans left. So my great-grandfather was part of that group that was moved to Fiji in 1945. And then I also have connections to the United States. My mother is African-American. She comes from very much from a military family. Her father was a colonel in the US military, and they lived in all parts of the world where the United States had military bases. But particularly in Germany, Japan, Korea. And she was also Catholic. So a lot of the women in my family are very Catholic on both sides of my family. And so my heritage is this mix of coming from an island, which is very much in Micronesia, in the Central Pacific, but then growing up in Fiji, which belongs to both Melanesia and Polynesia. All of these categories are colonial constructs that Europeans came up with, but these are constructs that now Pacific Islanders themselves have taken on and inhabited, and it's become part of their identities and the ways in which they express themselves. So in a way, coming from such a small people and connected to Micronesia, Melanesia, and Polynesia has allowed me to see things and occupy spaces and be in a particular kind of positionality where I can see things and experience things with many eyes, see things from many different perspectives, whether it's perspectives between islands or between disciplines. So even though I did my PhD in anthropology at the ANU and graduated in 2002, I weaved in lots of different disciplines into my research, into my work, including the performing arts. And I also tracked where our land went in the Pacific because it was mined and removed and used as fertilizer in Australia and New Zealand. For me, as someone belonging to that island, to that land, I continue to follow that land and see where it's gone through global agriculture to all of these other indigenous lands. So my location, if we were to think about our identities as being located somewhere, my locations are multi-sided and they're between islands. Now this island was in the news recently this year because the island ran out of fresh drinking water. And so Australia and New Zealand and the United Kingdom that mined the island did not clean up any of the industrial waste or debris or mining infrastructure that was left on the island. So the island is quite a polluted environment today where about 300 caretakers live. And because of all that mining and all that pollution, the island ran out of fresh drinking water, and its natural stores of water, which are underground in these underground caves, are no longer potable, so you can't drink that water. So Banaba kind of comes in and out of the news as a reminder of the impacts of colonialism, particularly British colonialism. And Banabans tried to fight for independence. They tried to fight for decolonization and to become independent and sovereign, but the British colonial administration would not let them, even though they appealed to the UN, and eventually they got subsumed into what is now the Republic of Kiribati. So we have had very much a colonizing history and a few attempts at decolonization, and that's kind of that's a form of political colonization and decolonization. And when you think of the topic of decolonization, you can think of it in a couple of different ways. One is formal colonialism by states over other entities, such as islands or cultures or peoples, and then decolonization becomes a formal process of decolonizing from that state. Or what I will be talking more about is the structural ramifications and impacts of colonization, which then continue through our identities, through our activities, through our knowledge systems, through our institutions. And as Indigenous peoples, then you are constantly working on decolonization on a number of fronts, formal or informal, or just in terms of our everyday lives, including in the academy. So this is just another map of the kind of work that I do, where I track, I follow people, I follow stories, I follow the land as it's mined and removed and spread over other lands. I use interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary methods, and I also use a lot of visuals in my work. I work between ethnography. I go out and I do research and I interview people and I do a lot of film work, but I also go into the archives and I look at things historically and I do ethnographic readings of the archives. And then I try to bring all of those things together and apply very much a kind of decolonial reading to all of the different stories and archives and interviews and research that I've done, which kind of tracks over about 100-year period. So I'm doing both history and I'm doing both ethnography in the present, and I'm adding to that many other approaches, including Indigenous approaches, and probably the most specific Indigenous approach that I use to frame and shape my research is that I locate our Banaban identities in that land, in that rock, which is called Tiapa. So Banaba means the rock, but the rock, which is Tiapa, is not just material land, but is the people as well. So land and people are one complex. They are not separate, different things. So we are born of the rock, we come from the rock, rock and people are one. And then if you think of land and people as being part of one complex, when that land is removed and spread over other lands, from an ancestral or Indigenous perspective, it throws up many new questions and new relationships. So for example, our land was used to fertilize a good portion of Victoria in Australia, the state of Victoria, and those lands belong to Aboriginal peoples. So Aboriginal peoples also see themselves as very much connected to and located in their lands. So you have to ask new questions about what is the Banaban relationship to Indigenous peoples of Victoria when our land is in their land. So that's just an example of the kind of research that I do. I use a lot of different metaphors and motifs of history and the impact of colonialism on the island to then reflect on what it means for humans to destroy the environment, to gut the land, to remove the soil, and what remains after empire, what remains after industrialization. And these are all questions that are very much relevant to thinking about climate change, for example. So these sorts of industrial processes contribute to the predicament that we're in today with climate change, for example. So for me, mining and global agriculture, which is the story of Barnaba, are not separate from the stories and the issues surrounding climate change, because all of those processes feed climate change. Climate change is what it is because of these sorts of extractive colonial histories. So that's what our island looks like now. And I wrote a book about it called Consuming Ocean Island, Stories of People and Phosphate from Banaba. And so, I did what academia expects one to. I wrote a book. That's what you're supposed to do when you're in academia. But I kept thinking about how important it is to decolonize our knowledge and to decolonize our forms of knowledge production, and thinking about other ways of telling this story, because it's not just the story for anthropology or for history or for academia for 5 people to read. This is a story about humans and what humans have done to the environment. So I was always thinking of different ways to share my research. Like, how can I go beyond the academy? How can I do things differently? And it helped that I have a background in the performing arts and also the visual arts. So my mom raised us to be dancers. We were always dancing, dancing, dancing. We will always have music in our lives. And so I respected those forms of knowledge, and I don't separate them from academia, even though I'm not in a school of art, which expects me to do art. I'm in the humanities and social sciences, but I was always trying to think of how to bring dance, how to bring music, how to bring visual arts into my work and have it count as knowledge. So I started experimenting. I've been doing this work over 20 years, and I started working with artists to reinterpret my research in multimedia formats. So this is an example of a chapter in a book that I participated in, where I worked with visual artists and designers and storytellers to do a comic book chapter based on my work, so that young people, for example, could read it and be interested in it and understand it. So that's just one example of interpretation or translation of my work into other formats. And then I worked with a wonderful Samoan, Japanese, New Zealand artist named Yuki Kihara. And Yuki and I collaborated to turn my research into a much bigger exhibition. So Yuki is a very celebrated artist in her own right, and she's been kind of an artistic mentor for me to turn my research into, in her mind, what is very high quality art, so I can tell this story to broader audiences. So I try to make that balance between the aesthetics and the academic content of my work, as well as my ancestors, my connection to Barnaba, and bring all of those things into one space while critiquing histories of imperialism and colonialism. So I created this timeline. You see a snapshot of my exhibition, which is Project Banaba, in kind of like a timeline format. So, you know, when you do history in the academy, if you're doing first year course, usually dates, for example, are really important. So people try to remember what happened on this date and what happened on that date. So I stamp all of these different dates in the exhibition, and then I bring quotes out of my research, bring quotes out of the archives to, you know, kind of tell this story. And it's quite a damning story of British colonialism. Below this images of the exhibition is a new project that we started last year, which is part of cultural revitalization for Barnabans. So I have this exhibition, but then we also work with Barnaban communities, especially in the diaspora, to revitalize some of our singing, our dancing, weaving, making of costumes. So I've been working with some elders and also some communities, usually remote because I can't travel to New Zealand. New Zealand's borders are up at the moment, but my exhibition will be up in Auckland next year, and it'll have this component, which is outreach to communities and to young people, and have educational components as well. So that's the kind of work that I do. So I'm just going to switch modes a little bit now and relate all of this to our Decolonizing the Academy project, because this project that we have and this website that we have, and I have a, you can see the website up there if you want to check it out. It's a culmination of all the things that I've been learning over time in terms of thinking about how to decolonize Barnaban histories, decolonize knowledge about the Pacific, hold colonialism, historical colonialism and imperialism to account in the present. And I've been thinking about what does that mean in terms of how we operate ourselves in the academy? Because you can go out, do your research and study those things over there. But when you come back to the university, those power relationships, those colonial structures, those imperial structures are still there in the academy. You go and you do your research and then you come back to your office and nothing has changed. It's not different, right? So I am not about only writing about these sorts of things. I'm about, hey, how can we do things differently in the academy? This can't be a theoretical kind of exercise. It has to be practical. It has to be applied. It has to change the way we teach, change the way we think, change the way we relate to each other, change how we understand power and hierarchies, for example. So the academy is a very hierarchical place where it's like lecturer, senior lecturer, associate professor, professor, and it's Banabans are a very egalitarian people. We have elders, and then we have everybody else, so we don't have chiefs. We don't have 500, different rankings of people. We don't have castes, things like that. We have families and we have clans and we have elders, and then we have all of us. And we don't usually, put too much of a spotlight on ourselves too, because it's not it's not taken very well when you try to elevate yourself above others. So I'm in the academy to study this, but my goal isn't to be some kind of big fancy important person. It's to have access to this knowledge. So we created this project called Decolonial Possibilities. That's the website there. And this is our definition of decolonization. We do, and this makes sense in Australia too, we center Indigenous knowledges and Indigenous peoples. And in our context, it is the First Nations people of Australia, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. But then in my thinking, we need to relate to them as Indigenous peoples from the Pacific in kinship and solidarity as well. And the academy doesn't always encourage that. The academy sometimes can be about divide and conquer, like not encouraging the building of solidarities and of kinship. So this project was an attempt for Pacific studies and Indigenous studies, Pacific people, Indigenous peoples of both Asia and the Pacific to connect to, collaborate, be in kinship with, and be in solidarity with Aboriginal and Torres Strait peoples. Because when we can do our own kinship, when we are sovereign and independent people without anyone trying to boss us around, we are the most generous people. We are the most kind, generous, hosting people. But colonialism has really tested, all of those values, really, truly, not just colonialism, but globalization, neoliberalism, capitalism, extractive activities, all of that has tested the very concept of, kinship and being welcoming and hosting people. And it makes it very difficult to be generous to others when you have come from that kind of history where you just, been infantilized by, Europeans or by other colonizers. So we created this project and we brought some very special people together. So I think at this point, it would be good then to just show the film, which is just around 16 minutes. And then we can just go straight into Q&A after that. And I'm hoping then we'll have about 15 minutes and then just have an open conversation about some of these things. But these are some of the lovely people who are involved in our project, and you can read more about them on the website. So what is the best, I'll stop screen sharing.
Ido is ready to show the video. Okay, Ido, go ahead.
The second song is the interactive song, so I hope your voices are all ready. And this particular song is called Walba Wanganye, and Walba means wind. Can you say Walba? Walba. And Wanganye, Wanganye. And that means speaking or talking, and that's in Yangunjara language. So Walba, Walba, Wanganye, Wanganye. And then the next word I'd like you to learn is Gulila. Gulila. And that means listen. And that's part of our thinking today, is that we really need to listen deeply. Waba wangani, waba wangani, waba wangani, waba wangani. Gulila, listen to the wind. Gulila, listen to the wind. Listen to the wind, it's telling us we're connected. Listen to the wind, it's telling us we're connected. Waba wangani, waba wangani. Gulila, listen to the wind. Gulila, listen to the wind. Thank you.
Spirits to come and join me. So the way I do that is with my old sticks. Should sound pretty good today, there's no wind. I can feel the spirits are with us.
This is our call to recognise signs that continue to mark and haunt contemporary Indigenous life. Our call to continue imagining the unimaginable and theorising from the position of the unthought. A kind of rememory where, despite being historically controlled and archived by the state to the point of erasure, our memories still exist out there in the world. Our memories are here, on this cultural precinct site, deeply social, collective, and waiting for us to bump into, so we might read the signs and create, and forgetting. It can sometimes feel impossible to navigate.
We can regale you with the litany of horrendousness at any of our institutions, but it's like we all think that they're special. I think there's a way that our institutions kind of draw us into this very dysfunctional, this sense of urgency and the sense of I must respond to this massive, it's not just like a little fire, but this bonfire, I must respond right now. And so everything ends up being in this kind of crisis mode.
It's about distribution of labour, yeah, and not having to do the work all the time. If you're like any person of colour, you're expected to answer questions that the institution has, even though you might not be from that region. Like, it's exhausting. There are days where I've actually had to spend half an hour on an email just trying to find the right words to actually, in a very diplomatic way, to actually explain what it is that the museum's doing is really problematic. But then it's like, well, that's me doing the label, and I shouldn't have to do that. Like, that's actually counterproductive. So it's like, are you paying me to do my actual job, or are you paying me to do cultural consultation? Because they're two very different things.
There's so many incredibly violent but also loving, beautiful reminders of our ancestors throughout these colonised cities. And often those local histories are erased. It's not just an academic writing about feeling something. It's actually like that embodied, lived experience that a lot of our community have this feeling of just the actual weight of where we are located and the weight of the knowledge of the histories that everyone else seems to be unable to understand or even remember.
It's just the nature of being Indigenous in a world that continues to make less space for Indigenous people. You choose to ignore it, then you choose to ignore it, but gosh, what's that going to do to your soul, you know? So I choose to act upon it every day because I'd rather do that than ignore these ancestors in me.
One of my struggles is getting non-Indigenous academics and researchers to engage with Indigenous research methods, because their want seems to be to make us brown versions of themselves, and do the kinds of research that they think is, or approach research in a way that they think would answer the questions that I have. But my questions come from such a different place.
So much of the work within Indigenous studies is funded directly by government, so I do feel a need to, on the one hand, protect it, but on the other hand, how much does that weakness its ability to change, to create change? So that's definitely something I'm juggling.
We can read the space, we can read the body, we can read how people are moving, we understand that quite clearly. And so when we go into a teaching space, what we find is we need to also make that space black space. And it's when we teach students about the trauma and the experience, it's not like we're not experiencing it over and over and over again. Because the kind of narratives or the kind of history, if you will, that we're telling is our history, it's about us.
Ultimately, what moves you and what moves students is the vulnerability of our relationships to the knowledge. So when we come together and have an intimate, inward-facing conversation with each other, what we are also doing is allowing people to see that we are vulnerable in the face of enormous, movements of power across countries, and that is unfinished business, that we are still collectively bearing that burden, and that we continue to do that. We hold space in spaces that are almost unbearable to hold space in, and it's only through each other and looking into each other's eyes that we can actually, that I have the strength to be able to do it.
I tell my students on the first day in PASI 101, and I think some of them think I'm crazy, but I'm like, I'm not here to just speak to your mind, and if I only speak to your mind this trimester, that I've failed. I want to tug at your guts, I want to pull at your heart, I want you to feel the Pacific with me. And if you don't feel it at the end of this, then I haven't done my job.
In my village, we have that kind of sayings. As a young man or young generation, you should let your body go ahead, let your mouth go behind. In my daily life, I do many works. I do cultivating, I do spearfishing, I do hunting, I cook, and I dance with my friends in the village, my people, my family. So all those kind of bodily practice produce that kind of affection habitus. So it cannot separate from myself, not only my body, my motion, my spirit.
A lot of us have a creative practice that exists alongside our proper research or our traditional outputs, and it is actually our creative practice that saves us within the academy, that keeps us there.
May I grow old enough to be forgotten. May my questions become passé. May my bibliographies become outdated. May my theories be superseded. May I be obsolete. May I teach students who teach students who teach students. May I meet these younger thinkers at conferences. May I read and cite their work. May I watch them stand more stably than I could ever have dreamed. May I sit in committee meetings where young colleagues raise new challenges because the old ones have finally been put to rest. May I watch the old guard quietly move on. But more than this, may I live long enough to be part of an old guard who younger scholars wish would retire. May I get to retire. May I see scores of Indigenous scholars write hundreds of Indigenous books that ask thousands of Indigenous questions. May I meet Indigenous vice-chancellors, presidents, professors and deans. May they not all be men. May I lie on a future deathbed and look back with regrets related to work rather than regrets related to family. May my passing be unshocking, not early, not unexpected. May I run out of ideas before I run out of time.
I've always known ANU as to be this kind of constructed space or constructed institution, which I kind of was like, what is it? And we were having these questions of like, what is the ANU? Is it the people? Is it the students? Or is it the, is it the chancellors? Like, nobody could actually say what is the university. And we want to make sure communities always come back to the museum. Do you want to ensure that, as ANU, as a collective body, an institution, do you want to ensure that Indigenous people feel safe here? Do you want to ensure that they can always want to come back and feel like they belong here? And it led me to think about this question, which is, do you want to see Indigenous people thrive?
It's challenging, again, to kind of get back to your question, to work in an institution where you want to liberate your students, but you're working in an institution that continually reinforces settler colonial power. So how do you kind of subvert that power? How do you challenge it? For me, it's in the classroom.
The solidarity that I really love is working with students. I mean, I get so much. I've taught students for 21 years, and our students don't enter the room as empty vessels. They come in with a world of knowledge, and when an educator can see that their knowledge is, we're an expert in a particular field, if that's what you want to call it, but we also have many bodies in the room who embody their own knowledges. And when we can actually shift that thinking and not just see ourselves only as always the expert, then that's where I think really strong learning can occur.
Our community is our student body.
Yeah,
we need to nurture and grow and protect and keep them strong, because they are in disciplines and they choose to go in disciplines that we are actively critiquing and dismantling in our work as Indigenous scholars. So it's about how to give them the tools, and this is where the creative arts, I think, is so powerful, to be able to educate and support them in those disciplines, through these really beautiful ways. So you get into the guts and the heart of trauma, and those really, some of those really violent histories of oppression and these ongoing struggles.
Most of the academic expect the scholars always talk by writing. Yeah, but as a scholars living in the indigenous community, as a member of the indigenous community, I'm required by the others. I have to do first.
I think the first things that university needs to do is acknowledge and understand that when Indigenous peoples welcome you to country, they are actually enacting their sovereignty, and that can never be taken, no matter how anyone looks at that or critiques that. And so in that process, it means the university has to reflect on its role of colonialism. And in doing that, in that process of truth-telling, that is the beginning to build reciprocal relationships, to form solidarity within the academy, between scholars, with students, and to form those communities within an institution. And I think something that we've done in these last few days is actually talk about the importance of connecting with Indigenous scholars locally, nationally, but within the Pacific and internationally as well. So in that sense, that solidarity means that you can sit in front of people and talk strong and talk about uncomfortable things. And as Donna Horaway would say, staying with the trouble and having those hard conversations, but working towards something that is a future far bigger than any one of us.
Thank you so much for screening that. I'm so glad we could do it that way. But yeah, so I produced that film. It's probably one of the first creative outputs of our school. And my director had to trust that we knew what we were doing because the flagship was very much supported centrally by the school. And, you know, we were trying to enact. We were very much trying to enact, you know, some of the arguments that we would normally make in our own research, but through a kind of a whole of school project. So, yeah, this might be a good time to open up for questions or discussion.
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. Teaiwa. That was a really wonderful presentation. And in fact, it was like a tapestry of your work. I mean, how you sort of weaved all those themes, okay, that you have been working on, producing this kind of portrait, or perhaps really a tapestry in itself of, you know, the possibilities of liberating us from these structures, which, of course, colonialism have left behind. And perhaps this is, again, I think, a point of discussion on how these structures are actually still in place in the academy, you know, regardless of context, national context, and how the academy, the university itself, perpetuates these particular structures of power relations and oppression. Okay. So, yes, the floor is actually now open for questions from the audience. So there are actually two ways. You can type in, your questions in the chat box, or just raise your hand and then we will call you to ask the question. Please don't forget to introduce yourself before the audience. Okay. Anyone?
Yeah.
Dr. Benagen?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes,
okay.
we do.
Congratulations for that inspiring presentation. And I have this number of questions. I'd like to limit to just one for now.
Okay.
I know what you're doing an extremely difficult job under extremely difficult conditions. What kind of institutionalizing support do you get from state policies, from university policies, in terms of one, staffing and budget?
Yeah. Yes, so that is an excellent question, because I have come to recognize that our school is quite lucky in the kind of leadership that we have. So leadership is everything, and having leadership and a director, for example, who's really open to us experimenting and doing things in different ways has been incredibly empowering. So I've been at the ANU since 2007. And before that, I was at the University of Hawaii. And before that, I did my PhD in anthropology at the ANU. And when I did my PhD, now almost about 18 years ago, this was not accepted. So one, you couldn't take a personal approach to your research. Personal was a big no-no. And my research was personal. Filmmaking, creativity, another big no-no. So a lot of senior anthropologists challenged me. And I think I was very determined, when I was in my early 20s, then to figure out a pathway through the academy where I could do things my own way. And for our people, for people from the Pacific, for many indigenous peoples, music, dance, singing, visual arts, the spiritual aspect of life, these are forms of knowledge. Not all knowledge is in writing. So I was really determined to do it in my research, to role model this for others, and then hopefully find a home where I would be supported. So what our director has done, and he's put a lot of faith in all the academics in our school. We're about 70 academics in our school across linguistics, archaeology, anthropology, Asian and Pacific history, gender, media, and cultural studies, and then Japanese studies, Chinese studies, South Asian studies, Southeast Asian studies. So we're very diverse group. He has provided funding for what we call flagship projects. And the flagship projects mean anyone from any discipline can come together and work on something different, creative, ask new questions, do things differently. So he's put about $30,000 into each of these flagship projects. We don't usually spend that much, so you can do a lot. I'm used to doing a lot with a tiny little budget, but having that whole scope of funding, and that's his choice and the choice of the leadership in our school, of which now I'm a member as well. That is our choice to do things differently. It's not the case necessarily with other schools at the ANU, though there is a lot of innovation out there, but there's innovation and still doing things in the same way. And then there's innovation and we make a film, and they say, yes, this is something good to invest in. So we work a lot with creative people, with students, and we made that film together. And I was just so happy that we could do that, because the academics who participated, they went back to their institutions and they said, look at this. This is ANU people doing things differently. So leadership, provision of the budget, and open to new, different decolonizing ways. And I did pitch that project also to the Vice Chancellor and his team as well. So once I pitched it and they said, oh, we like this, Decolonizing the Academy, I said, oh, wow, that's interesting. This is coming from Chancellery. Then the whole school was like, yay. So I was strategic in the way I made sure that different leaders accepted, supported, and liked the idea. That's a great question. Thank you.
Thank you. I have other questions, but maybe we should have the others first. And then I can come back later if you still have time.
Sure.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Binagan. Anyone from the group, from the audience? Okay. You may use the raise hand button at the bottom of your Zoom panel if you have questions. Okay. Right, so somebody raised his hand. Yes, Mark. Yeah, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I just wanna share my observation, ma'am, and sirs, because like when we talk about colonization of knowledge, we can't help but to really scrutinize, right, the way universities are run. Let's say from the textbook trade, authentication of social science literature, or even the promotion of scholars. There are many aspects in which there are really ways for the structure of dominance to continue. But I believe that language is as powerful and as creative as art. And we can use language to really counter things. My question is, how can we use English language as a way to colonize structures? Because English in itself brings something from the colonial, right? But that's also a form of connectedness for us, right? So we will be becoming aware of these things in our academia. And the next one is it really possible to change things given that some universities are becoming more elitist and corporatist, right? There are these rating systems that they have to comply with the publication requirements and etc. But still they use English. So how can we use English to really promote a different kind of discourse when it comes to our universities? Thank you.
Yeah, that is a great question. And Banabans and most Pacific Islanders have a really interesting relationship with English, given that most of us were colonized by English-speaking countries. So Banabans, for example, their language was colonized a couple of times by other islands and then by English, to the point where some of their values and some of the philosophies that were embedded in the original language no longer exist in language, but have to come out in other forms like dance or kinship or other kinds of relationships. My father, for example, also was very explicit about speaking mainly to us in English and making sure English was the language, the main language at home, because he had been through a colonized system where you could only get through primary school and high school and have opportunities to go to university if your English was perfect. And so he made sure his daughters were like extremely competent in English. And so the interesting thing though that came out of that process, I have two sisters and everybody got a PhD or an MD. So, okay, maybe this formula was working, but we critiqued the system in English, you know, so we kind of like flipped that relationship with that language, then became a tool in order to ask hard questions, to push back, but then also like using English in other ways. So my late elder sister, she's now passed away. She was a poet and she would use a combination of English and other languages. She spoke 5 languages and she would like weave them together and create silences or amplify certain things that still challenged, the colonial language that we all speak, which, as you say, is also really useful because it's a lingua franca. It's like what gets us to be able to communicate across so many different, there are over 1,000 languages in the Pacific. So we do need a common language, but being dominant in English didn't mean we were not critical. We were still critical of history and of contemporary issues. And I particularly am terrible at languages. I've spent years studying different languages and I'm utterly incompetent in all languages. This English is just so dominant for me, but I use language in other ways. So I use language of movement. For example, I'm very literate in dance, many different dance styles. So movement of the body is another language, or there are visual languages, there are visual grammars. And so I make sure that visual language, choreographic language, movement language is as important as spoken language, as oral traditions. We come from oral, embodied, visual, and material cultures. That is our language. Though our language is a constellation of all of those things together. So I have a very different way of thinking about language as something that's not just something that can be transcribed into textual form. That's one form of language. And then we have many, many spoken languages, but silence can do a lot of work as well. Like when you're not speaking, people know something is up. So I leave spaces on the page a lot. It's like blank. There you go. That was a great question. Thank you.
Brilliant. I love those ideas. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mark, for the question. And indeed, at this point, we really see how Dr. Teaiwa is, telling us about the creative possibilities of how we can, communicate, knowledge in different ways, not just confined to, the text. Okay. So we have another raised hand here from Doris Bacalzo, please.
Good morning. I'm currently in Switzerland, but of Philippine origin. So very pleased and glad to hear your presentation. If I may call you Katrina. So I was in Ateneo in 2016 to 18, but it's a pity I didn't meet you. But so from the Philippines, I also did some research in Melanesia, in Papua New Guinea. So anyway, so I really like the multimodality that you're bringing into this our academy. Yeah. So what I find interesting is about the context of the whole, what you call, and I agree with you, the whole colonial constructs around the regions, where we are all actually all very connected, and how we've been disconnected to all these different constructs. And so even talking about language indeed. And so I'm just thinking about also the particularities of context of our histories. So for example, coming from the Philippines, for example, I mean, for hundreds of years of colonialism, and I'm now talking about the deeply embedded internal legacies of colonialism. And part of that is, I don't know in which part that you're aware of, in the other part of our, islands of interconnectedness, of really where a lot of people working even in academia or connected in academia, and much more for people even outside who are at risk, just because of your voicing and making yourself visible and expressing your outer modalities. Yeah. So for me, it's a question of how so many forms of visibilities have been there, but I don't know, in your experience, how do you address when a lot of people who are doing this are at risk? So that's one. And that's basically because in the end, who do you speak to? Because when it's so internally embedded that within among your fellow, people that you live with, in whatever positions they are in. So it's not that you're speaking to somewhere else, but within. So that I think is a challenge. So thank you. That's just a way. I want to know what you think about that, or what you have to say to that. Thank you.
Yeah, so you're talking about how when you speak out like this, or you challenge, the structures and the system from within, how that puts you at risk or within a vulnerable position. So that's a great question, and it is very much something I experienced as a young academic. I've done some interviews about this, talking about toxicity, for example, within programs and departments where, as a junior scholar coming under attack from others, including people who are very senior, and then kind of the trauma of that, and then trying to figure out what to do or which way to go when you're maybe like publicly embarrassed, or people are like talking about you, or they're sending emails about you. Or another time when I was older, I went and participated in a protest, for example, with students at the ANU, and from my perspective, it was a pretty mild protest where people were gathered at Chancellery, and they were challenging, a very simple issue. But I started receiving text messages from others who were looking outside their window saying, "What are you doing? Why are you standing there? Like, go back and do your job. Like, why are you standing with students?" for example. And I was very confronted, like, why are you watching me? Like, where's academic freedom? Like, what's going on? So over time, I've had many of those experiences, and there's a couple of things that I usually turn to when I'm, experiencing that sort of thing, or I observe others being put at risk or doing challenging things. So I was the student of an amazing Hawaiian feminist, Haunani K. Trask, who's now passed away, who was a very strong Kanaka Maoli Hawaiian woman who challenged her whole university, demanded, that things change for the better for Hawaiian people. And she was very much penalized in many different ways by the institution, but also by her own people in many ways, like, so from within and from without. And she continued like very strongly to stick with her principles and to just move through that journey of going through that critique, going through those pressures, going through the experiences, while never shifting and changing what she believed in. So there are many strong women like that around the Pacific who, for me, are very much role models. And when I worry about stuff, I think of those women and I go, okay, we can do this. And, hopefully we're okay. The other thing is, my father used to tell me whenever things were very bad, things were very challenging, I would always pick up the phone and call him. I would tell him something was very difficult, or I felt, like somebody was coming after me because of the way I do things. And he would always just focus on strength again. He would say, whatever challenges you face, you grow stronger every single time. And I would cry. I would say, like, I don't want to hear this about strong. Like, come on, I'm crying to you right now. And he said, yes, but that's okay. That's part of it. You just get stronger every time. And now, recently I found out that I was promoted to professor at the ANU, and I will be the first Indigenous Pacific person to ever make professor at the ANU. And I suddenly thought of my father saying, you are getting stronger. Every single time I was crying to him about something difficult at work, something that wasn't working, people challenging the way I do things, me trying one way and maybe getting stabbed in the back by people that I thought I was helping. So many of these things happen to us in the academy, happen to us in the institution, but we don't change our values. You don't change how you do things. Yes, you be strategic, but you don't lower your principles or lower, your ethics on this stuff. You can put up barriers to keep out toxic people out, but as long as you stick with your values and you make space for others, including those who are vulnerable and also at risk or under attack, you show them, especially the higher you go up through the system, you show them that you're still the same person. So for example, we have Pacific scholars and artists and young people who very much speaking up about West Papua, about issues in West Papua. This is something that can be very risky, including when you have lots of colleagues from Southeast Asia, from Indonesia. It can be quite a difficult terrain to navigate. So I'm always really careful to be very supportive of people, including my colleagues, while still making space to amplify those voices who are speaking up for West Papua, because this is such an important issue. The indigenous peoples, Melanesians of West Papua, their issue needs to be global and people need to understand what's going on there. But it's a very tricky terrain when you're in Pacific studies with Asian studies colleagues who are also writing and passionate about that. So I feel like I do this quite a lot, like throughout my whole career, just trying to get that balance right, but not changing who I am in the process, sticking with my values, and always remembering what my dad means by being strong. Like there's physical strength, there's strength of character, there's having a strong heart. And in fact, that's a saying for Banabans, stand strong with your heart. So that's the kind of strength that I cherish and that I try to share with others. So it's a great question, thank you.
Yeah, if I may just kind of quickly just respond quickly, because it's very, I'm really, because what I'm hearing really, which I think I would like to be able, or us here to be able to articulate, is how important it is at different spheres of our social network of supports and relationships. So that whole trans-indigenous decolonization possibilities, I think that's a very good network to start with. I mean, coming from within and expanding. That's actually what I agree with you of what has been there or is still there. And I have to just acknowledge also, I mean, the kind of mentorship that we get. And, you know, so I mean, for example, Pons Binagin is here. I studied under him as well. So thank you. And I hope we continue this kind of thing. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Doris, for the question. In fact, it's really from what Dr. Teaiwa said. It's also from the Banaban framework of heart, where strength actually comes from. Right. So, Sir
something in the chat.
I have a question from the chat box. I'll call you once I read this question. Okay, right. So this comes from Nikos Dakanay, and I think he's tuning in from Melbourne. Okay, and then he's saying, in Melbourne, where I'm studying, academic settings highly encourage scholars to acknowledge country before any public presentation. I also observed this in some conferences in North America. What is the value of doing this, and how can this practice be encouraged in other settings in the Global South, such as here at the UGAT conference? Thank you.
That might be a question for the broader UGAT leadership, maybe, but I think it's important for a number of reasons, but I do think context matters. So acknowledgement of country makes a lot of sense in Australia, where the land belongs to Aboriginal and Torres Strait people. That land was taken away, or there were attempts to take it away, but people didn't lose that connection to those specific lands. So you still have clans and different groups who know exactly how they relate to the land, and they know it going back 60,000 years. Like it's not like a short period of time, it's in deep time. So places where there is an acknowledgement of country recognize deep relationships to land in deep time. That's where, for me, it makes a lot of sense. So, you know, for me, deep time is like 800 years all the way to 60,000 years, where you've been in a place for so many generations that it is as if you are of the land. You and the land are one, which is the same case for Banaban people. So that acknowledgement recognizes that, but what it also does is it foregrounds the possibility of kinship. So that when you are a settler or you are a visitor to that land, there's many ways you can connect. You can connect like a technical expert, some like development practitioner who is here to like do something and leave. You can connect in a more diplomatic way. But acknowledgement of country is basically saying one way you can connect to this place is through an acknowledgement of indigenous kinships, which are old, deep relationships that are beyond industrialization, capitalism, all of these other globalization accepted ways. It's saying we understand that this place is significant in a long frame of time, not just today, like who's been here for, you know, I don't know, 3 decades, or this for indigenous people is like blink of an eye, you know, like one generation is like, oh, 2 generations, okay, you know, like we're talking like deep, deep, deep time. So it allows you to decolonize the space and actually readjust your relationship to space. It also then shows the potential for political solidarity with the people of the land. Because if you don't acknowledge country, you're like, any land belongs to any people and everybody can come and it's a blank slate, right? Colonialism is all about treating spaces as empty and blank for whoever to come and do what they like. So when you acknowledge country, you're saying, no, this place belongs to these people, not like in a commercial way, not like in a property kind of way, buying, selling, buying. It's not what we mean by belonging to land. So acknowledgement of country is not a transactional thing. It's a different ontology. It's a different epistemology. It's a different axiology. So the more we bring those kinds of acknowledgements and relationships into our language, into our presence, when you move into space, the better you do the political work of solidarity. And the other big thing, I don't know if people noticed this in the film, everyone spoke of ancestors and ancestral connection and resonance and memory. So it's a way then to acknowledge, really, when you acknowledge country, their ancestors are looking at your ancestors because you bring your ancestors into this space. So they're looking at them and they're saying, okay, what kind of energy are you bringing here? So when Uncle Wally welcomed us, he actually asked the spirits to come and protect us. He said, okay, you're going to acknowledge that this is my country. I will call the spirits from that river over there, that lake, and I'm going to bring them here and they're going to help you and they're going to protect you. We need more of this kind of energy in this world. Not everything is just, you know, like money and power and whatever. No, we need the help, a very holistic sense of help and support. And that includes elders, ancestors. You know, I'm Catholic, so I could go on about all the other kinds of spiritual things, but this is why acknowledgement of country it's much more than just words, you know, like some read out something, okay, get on with it. It's very important.
Thanks a lot again. I mean, it's really a grounded kind of approach. I mean, it's beyond even this kind of expression, but ultimately it's really the connection we have that spans across time. Okay. So we have some questions here in the chat box. Thank you, Nikos, for that wonderful question. But I promised Professor Benagan another turn in the Q&A. Yes, Professor Benagan.
Okay, hello. Now, what did I want to ask? Okay, land and people are one. We have also amongst our indigenous peoples here in the Philippines, what they say is land is life. So it's a kind of a worldview, also a slogan. And the kind of work that you do, I know this may not be a fair question. You've been in it for something like 10 years. what has been the impact of the kind of work that you do in academia on the local communities yourselves that you work with? Are there mechanisms that are emerging to consolidate these mutually reinforcing decolonizing processes so that it doesn't take place only at academia, but more importantly for me, at the local communities?
No, that's a great question. I think it's very important. So I showed an example of the cultural revitalization programs, for example, that are going on in connection with my art exhibition, my multimedia art exhibition. So I worked with a team led by a gallery who put in an application, for example, for funding. And all that funding is going to the Banaban community in Auckland to be able to not just show up to workshops, but like get paid for their time because they're all, working and they all have kids and, like coming together is really difficult. So that's one example where, we generate funding for cultural revitalization projects. But back in Fiji, on Rambi Island, where many of our people live and where I have a large family, I have about 50 first cousins, and they all have children. So and my father is the head of the family. He's the oldest child out of 10 brothers and sisters. So we have a very, very large family on Rambi and across Fiji and also in Kiribati as well. So we're always connecting and supporting and being involved in programs and projects with communities on the island. I also have a great aunt who's a climate action leader in Kiribati. So I work closely with her, to share our knowledge and share different approaches and highlight and foreground the kind of work that she's trying to do. And luckily we have social media to be able to get feedback from the community about whether or not what somebody like me is making a difference in their lives. So we have a lot of different Banaban groups, like on Facebook, for example, where people are always talking to each other and we're sharing, like people know what I'm doing, like it's like Katrina did this and this, and you get feedback and you get different conversations about whether or not this is significant. And generally I get quite positive feedback from Banaban communities, much of it around this idea of pride that one of their own, coming from a people who are never given, access to universities or encouraged to go to university. Many young women might leave school at like year 8, year 9, for example. For them to see a Banaban woman doing this in academia means a lot to Banabans because they can see what's possible for them as well. And probably one of the most significant reflections of that for me was I saw a story from a young Banaban man in Auckland, and he was giving this amazing speech about climate change and the impact of colonialism on Banabans and phosphate mining and all of that. And I could see my own words and my own voice in his voice. I could see that he had read my work and that he had engaged with it because what he was saying sounded a lot like what I've been saying for 20 years. So I was so excited and I was so proud about that because I was like, wow, okay, things that I've been saying about our connection to our island, the importance of it, justice, the need for justice around Banabans, I'm now hearing in the voices of young people. Like they are giving my words back to me. And that means a lot because I don't tell people, go read my book or anything like that. I'm just, when I go home and go to the village, I'm like at home. I'm just like chilling, I don't go around giving speeches on the island or anything like that. But when I hear my own words coming out of the mouths of our youth, that means a lot to me. I say, okay, good. This might be the slow way of doing it. I've just been doing my work for 20 years, but when it makes an impact when it starts, sedimenting. I feel it's sedimenting amongst our young people. I can hear it, I can see it, and they give me that acknowledgement, especially through social media. Then I think, okay, not too bad. It's not too bad. But my sisters and I have other projects in the works where we're going to try to help and support our people a bit more. But you have to do it in a way that's, again, non-hierarchical, like not like, oh, we're this family and you're that family. Like, that's not the way to do it. And we don't operate in that way, even though we know we're privileged. We know we are privileged, especially in terms of education. But I just really try to do things that are less hierarchical and shiny, more like subtle ways of getting our learnings out there into the community. But that's such a good question and an important question about the impact.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Professor Benagan. So I guess we have different ways on how to communicate, okay, in a very horizontal way, just like we do when we reach out to people in the mall, in the park, our neighbors. So we have an interesting question here from Professor Fernando Jalzita. What do you think of the emphasis in academe of writing only for highly rated English-only international journals? Doesn't this shut out doing things in the vernacular? Doesn't this English-only monopoly colonize minds? There are insights into the world that cannot be expressed in English.
I totally agree with this, like 100% big time, because, and I am somebody who sits on, I think, 4 journal boards at the moment, in both interdisciplinary Pacific Island studies and anthropology. And I do remember when I was invited to be on the board of one particular anthropology journal, I said, okay, why me, first of all, because I don't actually publish that much in high impact English journals. The kind of career that I forged has been one where I'm like, this space is important, and then I amplify that space. This other space is important, and I amplify that space. For me, everyone is going for high impact disciplinary English journals. Like, it's just like a crowd. Absolutely everyone is doing the same thing in the same way. That doesn't actually make a lot of sense to me, because I'm all about reaching out and connecting to people outside the academy, right? And we know, now open access journals are more, now it's a thing, but before you had to have a subscription and you had to pay money, and, all the knowledge is kind of like in these narrow places. So for me, what I've role modeled getting to this place in my career is being able to do this without publishing in all of those places that are deemed the high impact journals. I'm like, you can do it. It's all possible, but it does take a bit of courage, and it takes support from others as well. So I did write a book. So yes, tick that box. I have some journal articles out there. I've got more book chapters out there, but almost all of those have been by invitation. They've been by invitation. It hasn't been me looking for somewhere. It's because I do things differently. Then people come to me and they say, oh, could you please, so because those invitations are so many, I don't even have space and time anymore to like go find a high impact journal. But that's been happening since I was in my 20s, since I was young, because I think at the same time you get pushback from gatekeepers, right? So you get pushback. At the same time, you have another group who's like, oh, she's making a new path. So let's all like try to get on board with this new path. So I don't agree with the ranking and the highly ranked journal approach. I think there's wonderful knowledge in many of these journals, but I don't subscribe to this idea that you get all your information, your theory, your methods, and the latest, like What is the latest issue that everyone's talking about? I don't think getting it from a particular journal is the way to go. The one exception that I have to that rule is our journal in Interdisciplinary Pacific Island Studies, which is called the Contemporary Pacific. You can look up, I'll put it in the chat, the Contemporary Pacific. It's this very different sort of journal where the board has kind of like wrangled with and worked through all of these different issues and asked questions, talked about decolonization, actively brought art into the journal, for example, and they're always featuring different artists, different ways of knowing and being and doing. They have different kinds of sections in the journal that are not just research articles. So they have dialogue, they have art reviews, they have, so that for me, I resonate more with that kind of journal, which is multimodal, very multimodal. So for me, as long as you're multimodal and not just about writing, not just about writing in English, then I'm like, cool, this is something different, you know. And so there are some visual journals, you know, there's some other places that do this sort of thing. But I'm almost to the point too, where I'm like, I have a lot, you know, I've had PhD students over the years. My job right now is looking after 110 plus PhD students in my school. So I'm the number one administrator looking after and supporting students across many disciplines. So I get to see all their PhD theses and everything. So I'm like really in this like PhD support, administration and training space. I have sort of made I'm thinking to myself, okay, for the next, wee while, I'm going to supervise thesis by creative works. So ANU has 3 kinds of theses. You can do thesis by publication, traditional thesis, and you can do thesis by creative works. Thesis by creative works is the space, it's like kind of like question mark. Like, what is that? Not a lot of people go into that space. Most people will do traditional thesis, and then a few people will do thesis by publication, and then there's a few outliers who will do like thesis by creative works. So I've decided that's going to be my focus for the next few years. It's going to be creative arts, but in the social sciences, in the humanities, not in the School of Art, where they do that anyway. So if I put my energy into supporting students working in that space, together we forge another way of doing things, because they're not going to put all their stuff in the journals that squish it all down into text. That doesn't make sense if you're doing thesis by creative works. So that's one sort of institutional decision I've made for myself at the moment. Like, if people are keen to do thesis by creative works, come and talk to me. If you want to do traditional thesis, here's 100 other academics who are wonderful at a traditional thesis. You can work with them. That will be beautiful. But because I have limited time and energy, my energy will support students who are doing things differently, using different forms of knowledge. I'm waiting for the next one who will do a thesis by TikTok. That will be like my greatest happiness, thesis by TikTok, like bringing together all those amazing bites of different dances and all of that, like bringing it together. So I just want people to be more creative and not just for the sake of creativity. It's not creative just for the sake of creativity. Creative approaches challenge dominant knowledge structures, and they challenge ideas about expertise. And people get very nervous if you start dancing. Then they're like, oh, not an expert, not an expert at that. That's right. You are not an expert in this dancing. So many cultures around the world, amazing dancers. Like, why aren't they running the world?
Thank you so much, Professor Teaiwa. In fact, dancing is really troubling, as in the tradition of queer protests.
Exactly.
So
it's powerful. Right. It's powerful.
Yes, definitely. Movement and the kind of communication it actually provokes. we are so grateful. In fact, the gems of wisdom that you have shared with us will, I think, be remembered. And in fact, they resonate with the audience. And fortunately, the Philippines is TikTok land. As you know, we are one of the social media capitals of the world.
I follow all of them. I watch all of them, and they're amazing. Of course, Filipinos are the best singers, best dancers. I'm
right.
like amazing.
Indeed, it is really a paradise of performances. Yes, we would like to hear more definitely from Professor Teaiwa, but it's Zoom time, and you know, Zoom time also has its own logics, if you know what I mean. So yeah, we're quite sad. We're going to bring this very wonderful session to a close. And so we would like to read this certificate, okay, of appreciation, okay? So Ugnayan Pang-Aghamtao Incorporated, okay, Department of Sociology and Anthropology, and the anthropological and sociological initiatives of the Ateneo and Institute of Philippine Culture present this certificate of appreciation to Professor Katrina Teaiwa for delivering a keynote speech titled Decolonizing the Academy, Trans-Indigenous Possibilities during the 43rd Annual Conference of the Ugnayan Pang-Aghamtao Incorporated. Okay. Signed, Skilty Sila Bastilla, UGAT President, Dr. Enrique Nino Pilaviste, Director of the IPC, and Dr. Jose Joel C. Canuday, Chair of the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, Ateneo de Manila University. As we say in Filipino, marami pong salamat, taos-puso po kaming nagmamahal sa iyo.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That certificate is so beautiful. I really appreciate it. Kampasin Rapa and Vinakavakalabusara.
With that, we bring this session to a close. Thank you so much for your participation. I think Dr. Tondo has something to say. Yeah.
We will request a family photo. Can you please turn on your video camera so that we can have a photo with Dr. Katrina? It will be our souvenir from her for this wonderful sharing this afternoon. Thank you. Put on your cameras, please.
Yes, all right. We have two panels. Let's take a photo of the first panel. 1, 2, 3. Everybody smile. 1, 2, 3. Okay. Let's save that. All right, moving on to the second panel. Everybody smile. 1, 2, 3. All right, we're all good po.
Thank you very much again, Professor Katrina. We hope to have more collaboration with you, especially since now we know that you're an anthropologist, but you have the same problem with the role of anthropology in colonization. Now that we know that, you will be hearing more from us. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. It was my pleasure. Thank you so much to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Katrina.
Oh, thank you. Lovely to see you.
Right. Okay.
Thank you for the facilitation, Jozon. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. You're most welcome. It's a delightful conference.
Yeah, very good conversation. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Nasi Nikos.
Hello, Ike. See you. Welcome again.
Hi. Good afternoon. Magandang hapon po sa lahat. I think we would now be going to the next session.
Let us check. No? Yeah, I'm
I
here.
think we have all the speakers we have. Really, right?
Let me check. Yeah, I guess. Our co-hosts, are they here? Are all the
Yes, sir. We may begin, sir.
yeah.
All good.
Who's the co-host here? You are hosting this mic now. You are moderating this now.
Yeah, I'm moderating this one. So I think it's a go now. Our time right now is 3:41. No? And we have three speakers this afternoon. So welcome to this session on decolonizing imperialist knowledge systems in agriculture, forestry, and higher education. So we have three speakers this afternoon. So I'd like to introduce the first. He's Dr. Max Agel, I think is correct, no? From Wageningen University and research. And his paper is on agriculture as means and ends of national liberation. Dr. Agel, you have the screen now.
Actually, I think we're presenting in a different order. I believe Dr. Katrina Mullen is going first.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Okay, so let's have Dr. Katrina Mullen from John Jay College, City University of New York. And her paper is on decolonizing imperialist knowledge systems in higher education. Dr. William?
Hi. Yes, hi, thank you. And sorry for the last minute changes to the order. But
it's all right.
Thank you
it's
so
right.
much to the, thank you. And thank you so much to the conference organizers. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here with you all today. And thank you also to Sarah Raimundo for organizing us, and to Max Isle and Sarah for being on the panel together. So the focus of our panel is on the agricultural question, food sovereignty, and indigenous knowledge production as a challenge to ongoing neo-colonial domination. And there are many ways to understand the failure of global South states to achieve or maintain full sovereignty and self-determination after the end of formal colonization. The focus is often on military or political economic dimensions of imperialism. So, for example, the role of international financial institutions or so-called free trade agreements, military invasions, or covert forms of destabilization in cheapening or labor and enabling debt and dependency. Although there is an increasing focus on epistemological concerns, often it is disconnected from the material and institutional dimensions of neocolonialism. In this paper, I seek to bridge the gap between these two approaches, examining the political, economic, and epistemological dimensions of decolonization, and to highlight the institutional context, which shapes and in many ways limits, but also enables certain forms of decolonial struggle within the colonial capitalist university. Although my paper is focused on Tunisia, including a periodization, locating the Tunisian University within broader dynamics and processes across the African continent, I think or hope that some of the theoretical contributions can be generative for discussions of questions pertaining to the global South more broadly. So similar to institutions of higher education elsewhere in the global South, the history of the modern Tunisian university has its roots in French colonial rule. Yet despite its origins and ongoing entanglements with imperialist knowledge systems, the Tunisian University has served at important conjunctures in the country's modern history as a space for or anti-colonial knowledge production, political organizing, and the forging of insurgent subjectivities. So this paper adopts a longue durée approach to examine resistance around the Tunisian University, tracing current material and epistemological struggles back to the era of anti-colonial struggle. Founded in 737 CE, Tunisia's Zaytouna Mosque University is renowned as one of the oldest learning institutions in the world. Its famous alumni include the historian sociologist Ibn Khaldun, the trade unionist and writer Tahir Haddad, the prominent nationalist and founding member of the Destur Party, a constitution party, Abdelaziz Talbi. In the years leading up to Tunisia's 1956 independence, Al Zaytouna was the site of fierce political as well as epistemological resistance to French colonial domination, and later to the gradualist and Western-oriented independence agenda that garnered Tunisia's first post-independence president, Habib Bourguiba, the support of the French and other Western powers in the context of nationalist struggle. Rooted in a dialectics of power and resistance dating back to the anti-colonial movement and up until the current moment of capitalist expansion and popular contestation, struggles over the Tunisian University are in many ways emblematic of efforts to complete the socioeconomic and political institutional decolonization processes initiated across the African continent and the global South more broadly from the 1940s onwards. The post-independence trajectory of the Tunisian University roughly reflects the three broad periods of development of the African University that Paul Tiambe Zeleza has delineated. The first, the golden era, was the period of expansion and state investment from the 1950s to the 70s, underpinned by the triumph of African nationalism and the euphoria of independence. Although, as Mahmoud Mandani has argued, deracialization was central to this stage, it was not the only requirement, as full decolonization would depend upon the extent to which it shaped the institutional form or the curricular content that breathed life into it. Post-independence governments were central to the transformations underway in higher education, yet it is important to note that they were both shaped and sustained by intellectual social movements from below. Some African universities, such as Dar es Salaam, were more successful than others in achieving real structural transformation, for example, by challenging the colonial capitalist division of disciplines and developing a critical decolonial pedagogy. Even those like the Tunisian university system that failed to achieve a pedagogical decolonization nonetheless witnessed shifts to ensure a curriculum more relevant to the region's socioeconomic development aspirations, concerns, and problems. So the repurposed university also provided intellectual and material space for new modes of thinking and forms of organizing in the post-colonial state. In the Tunisian Golden Era, the state university was one of the few places where leftist, anti-imperialist opposition could be expressed to the increasingly repressive Bourguiba government. And it continued over the years to provide a limited space for different forms of political organizing and dissent. This era also saw a flourishing of Marxist analysis of Tunisian society and uneven development in the academy. And as my colleague and co-panelist Max Eil has explained, even the emergence of a particular version of Tunisian independence theory. The golden era of African universities did not last long, though, and was quickly followed by the crisis era from the 1970s to the late 1990s, brought about by the neoliberal economic restructuring mandated by international financial institutions as part of the neo-colonial counter-revolution on global South liberation. Central to this project was defunding those public institutions central to sustaining life and liberation, such as higher education, which had expanded exponentially during the post-independence period. So during this era, the Tunisian university became increasingly imbricated in global capitalist structures that peddle higher education reform as part of a broader political project to restructure the economy so that it can better accommodate the needs of largely foreign capital, shaping the ideological superstructure so that the population ultimately comes to view the IFI, International Financial Institution agenda of capitalist expansion as normal, inevitable, and even enviable. But student mobilization during this era was largely defensive in nature, concerned as elsewhere on the continent, where the neoliberal assault on public institutions is well underway, with the struggle against defunding, privatization, and an expansion of market logic and mechanisms into the university. Though scholarly attention is often placed on the material impact of these policies, political economic processes, Mamdani notes their epistemological implications in terms of reducing the possibilities of self-reliant knowledge production. Where the experience of the Tunisian university and that of many other continental universities part ways with Zeleta's higher education periodization is vis-a-vis what he describes as the recovery era, where the recessions of development and democracy are deemed to have been halted and in some places reversed. Although the 2010 to 11 Tunisian revolt achieved some respite from repression for university struggles, it also witnessed another round, as with other state institutions, of cuts and increased intervention from neoliberal actors like the World Bank. Yet failure to complete this phase is by no means a foregone conclusion, and perhaps recovery is even too limited a vision for the kinds of struggles unfolding within and on the margins of Tunisian higher education today, rooted in a critique of the persistent epistemological and material effects of neocolonial rule on the university, as well as the broader institutional and political economic context. These resistance movements have sought to complete with the more radical Afro-Arab Islamic third worldist strain of Tunisia's nationalist movement, weakened by both internal power struggles and external neocolonial and imperial intervention, was ultimately unable to achieve an end to Tunisia's colonial domination. So my paper examines and builds upon theoretical insights from the growing bodies of literature concerned with how colonial capitalist power is manifested and contested in institutions of higher education, including Marxist, decolonial, and social movement theory traditions, with a focus on how these critiques have been expressed and applied primarily within the African context. And it focuses on four important conjunctures in the development of the Tunisian Academy, including the three most intense decades of anti-colonial struggle from the 30s to the 50s, the 1968 to 1969 student protests, the years of neoliberal restructuring, and the 2010 to 11 uprising and post-uprising period of accelerated neoliberalism and intense social struggle within and outside of the university. So I don't have much time remaining. So in the last few minutes, I would just like to make a few points about the theoretical framework. And in doing so, highlight some examples from the Tunisian case. So the Marxist approach that I use in the paper highlights the role of educational institutions in the socialization of students, interpolating them as docile subjects willing to accept exploitation at work, as well as future life conditions. The education system is engineered from a Marxist perspective, of course, to produce an amenable and fragmented labor force to meet the needs of capitalist production. Marxist approaches also consider the ways in which schools function to legitimate as well as exclude certain ideologies, productions of knowledge, and social formations. But precisely because of their centrality to ideological dominance, Gramscian approaches also see, for example, education and knowledge production more broadly as key to anti-capitalist resistance. So although this is true everywhere there is capitalism in the global South, given the value drain associated with unequal exchange and the requirements of Western capital to the working population, the requirements of Western capital, that the working population is disengaged from the production process so as to curb workers' control over their state and natural resources. It means that higher education materializes, as my esteemed co-panelists Sarah Raimundo and Carlo Mongaya have put it, as a consumable commodity that is instrumentalized to serve the interest of finance and the exploitation of labor and resources. So using a Marxist approach helps to understand not only the functioning of the colonial or neo-colonial Tunisian university in expanding and normalizing colonial capitalism in Tunisia as a mode of production entailing super exploitation of labor, extraction of natural resources, and other forms of resource drain, but also the forms of resistance, in particular leftist and anti-imperialist organizing, often repressed on university campuses in the post-independence era, especially in the 60s and 70s, as the student body became increasingly frustrated with the ongoing reality of dependency. For the decolonial approaches, they combine a discursive claims of post-colonial thought and materialist concerns of world systems theory. So decolonial approaches to knowledge production often posit the central role of education in obscuring the uneven histories of accumulation, dispossession, and state formation that have shaped the context in which the post-colonial global South remains bound to the global North in subordinate relations. Higher education can be seen as one of the central axes of what the decolonial scholar Aníbal Quijano describes as the colonial power matrix, facilitating the reproduction of the global system's racialized, epistemic, and material hierarchies. So however, so part of that process of decolonial scholarship is to deconstruct or expose, demystify the function or the role of higher education in this colonial power matrix. But it's not just about demystifying power, but also producing alternative knowledge that can be put to the service of liberation. Moving beyond colonial pedagogy, decolonial education projects focus on collective, non-hierarchical forms of learning and ways of knowing outside of imperialist knowledge systems. So in this paper, I use this approach to understand anti-colonial struggle, in particular as it unfolded at the Al Zaytuna University that I mentioned at the beginning, as a site of epistemic freedom or epistemic sovereignty, able to maintain a degree of independence during the colonial period, and thinking about how it managed to partially avoid disciplinary nationalism, and how it was a site, because of its epistemological sovereignty, it was a site of fierce anti-colonial resistance and a much more radical version of nationalism than that which prevailed in the end with the Western-oriented post-independence president Bourguiba. So one of the major leaders of the more radical strain of Tunisian nationalism, Salah Ben Youssef, was very close to this institution. He delivered a famous speech denouncing the staged decolonization process that Bourguiba had adopted. He denounced it on the stairs of Al Zaytuna University and called for a more complete independence from France, and one that was coordinated with other anti-colonial struggles in the region. So just to sort of conclude also, I look at this approach and think about what it can tell us about contemporary decolonial knowledge projects that have, although I do have an analysis of why and some of the constraints to decolonization, decolonial pedagogy, and decolonial knowledge projects within the university. I do look at how these projects have unfolded in large part on the margins of the university or outside of the university in the post-2010 to 11 revolt period. And this includes research institutions like the Observatory for the Tunisian Economy that challenge the domination of international financial institutions over knowledge produced on Tunisia's economy and the role of the experts in articulating and pursuing national development. Other organizations like the Observatory for Food Sovereignty and the Environment similarly seek to break epistemological and material relations of dependency in the realm of agriculture by centering the knowledge and experiences of peasant production in developing sustainable alternatives to colonial capitalist agriculture and food systems. There is also a growing number of Tunisian scholars, activists, and organizations engaged in critiquing the detrimental impact of international financial institution-backed export-oriented, water-intensive, supply-based monocropping of the land, climate, and livelihoods, as well as promoting ancestral knowledge of small farmers. New experiences of collective self-management of land and permaculture are also emerging in different parts of the country and producing new knowledge about the land, community, and sovereignty. And just to sort of conclude, I do also have a section on social movement theory and the embodied knowledge that comes out of movements. So we often don't think about that in terms of decolonial knowledge projects, but there's quite a lot of knowledge that comes from social struggle outside of the university, and often referred to as kind of embodied knowledge or cognitive praxis about, for example, how to shut down extractive industries like oil and the phosphate industry in Gefsa in Tunisia, and how to combat the police if you're involved in a struggle that's being repressed by police violence, how to engage in pitched battle with the police. A lot of this knowledge about social movement organizing, networking, resisting police violence gets passed down from movements. And so I have a section on that too. And I think it's really important to consider that as part of the decolonial knowledge project. So I conclude my paper by reflecting on the differences between colonial and colonial or neocolonial versus decolonial knowledge production, whereas the former works to enable and normalize the destructive and grossly unequal patterns of extraction and accumulation associated with neo-colonial capitalism. Decolonial knowledge projects instead seek to transform Tunisians' relations with one another, with the state, and with the land in ways that promote the forging of the collective and meaningful liberation. Thank you.
Well, very interesting. Thank you very much, Dr. Molin. As I follow through the presentation historically, it shows how things had evolved and how university becomes a contested space, both for colonialism and decolonization. Thank you very much for that. Thank you. So our next, we'll have a summary of that later on, and perhaps could have more discussion during the open forum. Ms. Sarah Raimondo would be the second presenter based on the updated schedule. And she's from the University of the Philippines, and she's going to talk about what and how can the Ifugao Muyong system teach us about decolonization. So we're getting out from the university, from an educational institution, and then go to the field. I don't know how it's going to be connected. That's something we're going to hear from Ms. Sarah. Ms. Raimondo, it's your screen now.
Yes, thank you so much. So this presentation is about the Ifugao Muyong system, but it also goes beyond that, precisely to capture the history and challenges that have shaped the Muyong as an indigenous system in its current form and status. Muyong is an indigenous method of tending the forest. In Ifugao, Muyong literally means forest or woodlot. They are owned by farming clans, and they vary in sizes from 0.5 to 3 hectares, depending on the clan's economic status. As a system of forest management, the Ifugao Muyong system combines technological know-how in production as well as knowledge related to biodiversity, resource use, and indigenous rituals and practices that also speak to survivability of kinship and inter-village alliances. Currently, Muyongs are under threat on account of at least 2 trends summarized in the research by Camacho and colleagues. First, modernization of farming, particularly the shift from organic to inorganic farming methods. Second, a declining interest in farming among the younger generation, resulting in the abandonment of the Muyong system, unquote. In this presentation, I focus on the aforementioned threats on the Muyong system. I argue that while the Muyong is an indigenous forestry system that is part of the lived experience of the indigenous people in Ifugao, the threats to this system observed by researchers are not unique to this particular forest management. The modernization of farming and the divestment of the younger generation from this mode of producing livelihood are conditions that have also been observed and repeatedly cited across farming regions in the Philippines, that is from lowland central Luzon to the Visayas and Mindanao. I make this otherwise commonplace observation to emphasize that the indigenous question that is at the heart of this threatened forestry system is also an agrarian question that cannot be separated from the colonial and national question of our century. Does this mean erasing the particularity of the indigenous question by conflating it with the agrarian and national question? I will go back to this issue in a bit. But for now, what do we know about the Muyong system? The Ifugao-Muyong system is relatively one of the more researched, analyzed, and government-affirmed indigenous practice. It's home to 264 species, mainly indigenous, belonging to 71 plant families that thrive in these conserved zones. The Ifugao-Muyongs are identified as storehouses of biodiversity. They have also been adopted as assisted natural regeneration strategies, as Busok and Niglok note, in agroforestry, multiple cropping, enrichment planting, and protection efficient silvicultural systems, whole tree harvesting, and good wood utilization practice. For a good number of researchers, the Ifugao-Muyong system shows how, quote, indigenous knowledge, local knowledge, traditional forestry practices, indigenous practices, and indigenous knowledge systems, unquote, are concepts that bleed into each other, reflecting the fluid dynamic characteristic of social practices relating to indigenous peoples' upkeep and modes of survivance. As clan-owned and managed forests and watersheds, the Muyong covers the mountain ranges, provide ample water supply to rice paddies, and minimizes soil erosion. It also serves as a source of fuel, wood for house construction, and edible fruits. Other uses of the Muyong include its function as a buffer that marks boundaries. The Muyong system also serves as settlement for grasslands, Sweden farms or uma, and payo or rice terraces. Sweden farming is identified as the oldest type of agroforestry practiced by the Ifugao. It is believed that this method has for centuries promoted land stability and productivity, and it involves apuyan or burning, lotang, fencing, and mungabot or weeding. In other words, the Muyong system is highly associated, if not synonymous, with an enhanced upland cultivation. Existing research on the Muyong system also draw connections between indigenous knowledge and sustainable forestry practices. The Muyong system reinforces significant customary policies and practices that the Ifugao observe, from the rules of boltan or inheritance, gatang or hubli or purchase, palog or trading, tupon anupan, hunting ground, and odnomi or verbalized expression of land ownership. The Muyong system also sustains the indigenous practice of customary laws reflecting rich traditions and beliefs that are expressed as rules of the forest. Animating these indigenous rules are enchanted rituals and beliefs that align with values of resource management and conservation. The Muyong system also compels the Ifugao to observe stand management to maintain a healthy forest cover. These practices include hikwatan or cleaning, tanoman or planting, selective cutting, happy or the felling direction, and bibio or warning signal. But there is trouble in paradise. In a 1999 study on the Muyong featuring the cutting of trees as signal of the dynamics of social change in the Philippine uplands, Edsel Sahor challenges the pristine representations of the Ifugao Muyong system, arguing that these have been considerably eroded and changed. Further, Sahor challenges government's assumption that the Muyong system has remained impervious to change by highlighting broader socioeconomic forces. While Sahor recognizes that the Muyong system has been destroyed by or has come under threat through direct and violent actions that separate the timber user from his or her forest, such as what has occurred in instances of land grabbing or forcible logging activities by powerful outsiders, his main focus, though, is problematizing what happens to the Muyong system as local communities become integrated into wider socioeconomic and cultural currents. In short, Sahor chooses to highlight the micro-level agentic dispositions and interventions of social actors and how the same reproduce the boom and bust of the commercializing trends in the Philippine economy, characterized by import substitution and export orientation, and all brokered to direct foreign investment, structural adjustment, foreign aid, and foreign debt by the Philippine state. I have no time to discuss Sahor's findings in detail, but his historical discussion of the development of a commercial economy affecting the Muyong system provides a resource for a decolonial critique of the identified threats on the Muyong system. The local farming deterioration and the wood carving boom in Ifugao can be traced to the post-war developments in the Cordillera. and are built on the core colonial projects by the Americans from the early 1900s leading up to the war. The deep and continuing impact of the following colonial projects that Sahor identifies continue to shape the economic livelihood of the people in many communities in Ifugao. First, the integration of unpacified and independent upland village societies through an effective peace and order campaign. This is a code word for counterinsurgency, and the establishment of local governments. Second, the breakthroughs in road building in the entire Cordillera, especially in the Ifugao province. Third, the institution of compulsory education. And fourth, the promotion of trade and marketing between far-flung villages and the poblacion. The American colonial period consolidated self-sufficient village society economies into a broad grid of trade, labor, and consumer market. This condition was conducive to the movements of goods and people within the mountain region and to the lowland areas. These conditions, which were further improved by the government after World War II, and these were two imperialist wars, allowed for certain indigenous crafts to be linked to the urban and export markets. Particularly the development of wood carving industry would have dramatic impacts on livelihoods and resource use and the environment in Ifugao villages. The Marcos dictatorship paved the way and brokered the wood carving cottage industry as a non-traditional export and imbued it with tax exemptions. The granting of tax credits on export sales was enacted under the Export Incentive Act of 1970. This and other various loans to promote small-scale handicraft cottage industries were implemented. It must be mentioned, though, that what really boosted the export sector was the Philippine state's decisive turn to float the peso side by side the US dollar in 1970, which resulted in the devaluation of the local currency. That wood carvers who were originally rice terracing farmers in their place became increasingly nomadic, scoring various parts of Ifugao for abundant wood supply is an important outcome on labor of this economic trend. However, and as expected, a major downturn in the wood industry happened in the first half of the 1980s. Documented growth rates during this period fell to less than 5% in 1980, to less than 3.5% in 1981, and to slightly above 1% in 1982 and 1983. Exports fell dramatically because of high domestic interest rates and imposition of export taxes. State intervention at this point came in the form of the promotion of commercial vegetable gardening among the local farmers. The Municipal Agricultural Office distributed seed packages of beans, cabbage, radish, potatoes, pechay, with brochures to local farmers demonstrating the proper application of imported chemical fertilizers and pesticides. Key to this undertaking was the Presidential Assistance for National Minorities, or PANAMIN, that provided so-called aid to farmers. PANAMIN facilitated foreign inputs to local farming. Aside from commercial vegetable gardening, two cropping more than rice variety also started. State intervention at this point curtailed the right to food sovereignty as it brokered indigenous villages to a dependent relationship with foreign capital through environmentally harmful farming products. This historical briefer is important in approaching the identified threats to the Muyong, namely the modernization of agriculture and the changed aspiration of the younger generation who are no longer inclined to farm production. The threats to the Muyong are arguably the outcome of colonial and neo-colonial projects that reduce indigenous knowledge and traditional farming methods as inferior and a barrier to development. The observed gradual abandonment of Muyongs and the observed divestment of the younger generation from indigenous knowledge is neither an internal factor nor a trajectory of indigenous knowledge in the 21st century. It is an instance of confrontation between profit accumulation by the core and neoliberalization in the periphery that has its foundations on a colonial history. Peoples in the global south in the age of unequal exchange between nations with relative geopolitical and economic influence are confronted by problems of coercive states that promote and embrace foreign direct investments. This dominant feature not only erodes indigenous knowledge, but in many cases and on a global scale, criminalizes indigenous peoples for practicing their indigenous knowledge. This in turn prevents just transitions involving people on the ground, which should animate and inspire the education of young people. This is about children seeing and feeling support for their livelihoods, which are the building blocks of human aspirations. This condition is a terrain where the project of decolonization that involves a broad process of liberation of peoples and nations must be lifted up as an urgent academic undertaking. The veritable struggle for the right to self-determination by indigenous peoples, First Nations, Black people, movements for national liberation, socialist and communist movements have historically been a struggle that has sought to consolidate the most oppressed, patriotic, and progressive forces in society against colonialism and its present forms in an imperialist system. In other words, the struggle for the right to self-determination has challenged the fragmenting logic of capital that frames resistance as an unspoken competition between and among interest groups who demand for a larger share of the pie or the spoils of capital, a characteristic disposition in NGO industrial complex funded by business monopolies and Western core states. No other struggle in the past 2 centuries, and surely in the present, has brought together various sectors and classes to unite against neocolonialism, imperialism, and imperialist-backed authoritarian governments in the global south, while also maintaining independence and initiative among these sectors. And that is the indigenous people's struggle for land, life, and for genuine autonomy, the peasants' struggle for land redistribution and food sovereignty, the workers' anti-imperialist struggle for self-management, wages, and benefits, women's and LGBTQA struggle against violence and for a just gender system, and the sectoral yet universal struggles for free education, public health care, affordable housing, and climate justice. This struggle challenges the incursions of capital on both national and local scales. Capital is never selective or particular. Bridging particular struggles to broader people's struggles, such as locating the indigenous question at the heart of the agrarian and national question, is far from erasing and conflating such a struggle. I am making this point not even as a matter of prescription, but as a historical point that's been observed and well documented in the struggles of indigenous peoples of Latin America and the Caribbean, the Philippines, West Papua, the First Nations and Red Nations in North America. Concrete and historic victories were also observed in the struggles of the ethnic minorities of Russia and China during these countries' past anti-imperialist struggle and socialist construction. Historically, such fraught struggles heighten and shape the lives of minoritized peoples through the dialectic of unity and struggle within organized movements. This is a compelling reason for academics to not only be good at, but also move beyond academic decolonial incrementalism via syllabi construction within the current imperialist system. Decolonizing the mind also means being mindful of actual struggles for decolonization raging worldwide. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Raimondo. I could see now the connection with education at the end. And it's really, historically you could trace it, and that's it. No, later on I'm going to make a connection of all the presentations. So this time I'd like to introduce again Dr. Max Agel. I hope I'm correct, from Wageningen University and Research, and he's going to present a paper on agriculture as means and ends of national liberation. Dr. Agel, your screen now.
Fantastic. Thank you for the introduction, and sorry for all the shuffling of the presentations. Thank you also in particular to my co-panelists, Drs. Karina Mellon and Sarah Raimundo, for their presentations, which I would like to build on and probably revisit a few of the themes, especially of Karina's, since we actually met one another in Tunisia. And so we deal with similar issues. So I would like to start with a figure out of who was Amilcar Cabral, not merely a leader of anti-colonial practice, not merely a leader of the national liberation struggle, but also, interestingly and somewhat neglected, or maybe one can say entirely neglected in the work on him, an agronomist. So very much focused, in fact, on the means and ends of peasant production. This to say, although I won't be delving into his agronomic writings, I mean this only to say, as a definite argument from clear authority, he knew what he was talking about when it came to the peasantry. Cabral famously defined decolonization, or national liberation, as the process of reclaiming the right usurped by imperialist domination to determine the process of development of the national productive forces. He wrote that liberation takes place only when such forces are completely free from all kinds of foreign domination, opening up the field, determining the mode of production most appropriate to the evolution of the liberated people, in turn opening up new prospects for the cultural development of the society in question. Of course, Cabral was writing first of all about agriculture, given that colonized society therefore decolonization or liberation of the forces of production and their subsequent development would be central to the progress of agricultural dominated states. Yet perhaps oddly, agriculture has not featured centrally in the decolonial literature, even on the level of epistemology. Perhaps this is secondly odd because central agriculture was to the great anti-colonial peasant wars of the 20th century, peasants' liberation, of canonical writers on decolonization, and practitioner theorists like Mao Zedong and Ho Chi Minh, as well as central reference points in post-colonial studies, namely Frantz Fanon and Amilcar Cabral. Perhaps less appreciated in the theory and practice was that such theorists did not merely place the peasant at the center of social, national, and struggle, but also often put them and their knowledge technologies as central to socialist construction. This was especially prevalent in post-liberation China through a people's agriculture that, at least during its first 30 years, focused especially on the restoration and improvement of excellent agricultural technology and focused on a people's science, a decentered experimentation, organically building on extant popular logics. In what follows, I want to put forward a few intellectual sketches of the period, the post-colonial period in Tunisia, focused on epistemological and material or potentially material processes of agricultural decolonization. I focus especially on several Tunisian scholars, Azam Mahjoub and Slahdin al-Laman. Mahjoub was an economist who focused initially on the relationship between industrialization in Tunisia over time and space, and later on the epistemological approaches to appropriate industrialization, agriculture, and development writ large. From a slightly earlier generation, Amami was an economist who emerged from the Tunisian student movement in the 1960s and then entered the Tunisian planning process. Their methodology was focused on intellectual decolonization, but was linked and was a reflexive approach which moved easily between the material and the intellectual cultural planes and then back again. They examined the iterative links between colonization, decolonization, and national liberation, focusing especially on technological choice, reflecting and reinforcing one intellectual cultural matrix rather than another, and how technological choice, that is, the physical crystallization of thinking, was neither neutral nor innocent. It reflected a given value system and reflected the global law of value, and in fact, reflected and reinforced uneven development and unequal exchange. Mahjoub was more the historian, and in one work or another, drawing directly on Samir Amin and Andre Gunder Frank, creatively applied their methodology to the Tunisian context. He showed initially the relationship between dependent industrialization and dependency more broadly. Amami, in turn, turned his lens closely on agriculture, shifting between focus on the Green Revolution, irrigation technology, seed production, and the overall contempt for what was called tradition. His critique and the project that he critiqued was closely linked, as Dr. Mullen was showing us, to the dominance of neo-colonial dependency within the Habib Bourguiba so-called developmental project. Post-colonial governments had rejected the Arab nationalist project at the geopolitical and geoeconomic level, the Bandung orientation at the national developmentalist level, and in turn, the so-called traditional at the cultural and technological level. Reacting to this way of thinking, Amami totally rejected the universalizing and flattening tendencies of industrial and especially northern theories of development, which in fact sought to universalize what was a particular and parochial pattern of development and especially agricultural technological development. He connected the kinds of thinking encouraged in the national schooling system and how foreign corporations were turning Tunisia into an arena for profit. He saw that neo-colonial capitalism's conversion of Tunisia into a dependent arena rested on the local production and reproduction of neo-colonial ideology. Of course, if this was bane, it could also be boon, because insofar as neo-colonialism rested on specific local structures of thought, it could accordingly be challenged by an attack on those structures and the institutions which reproduce them. Supporting Dr. Mullen's anatomy of the role specifically of education in the reproduction of underdevelopment, Amami specifically analyzed the engineering school's contempt for what they called the traditional and the technologies to which the slur referred. In disdaining over pre-colonial techniques, this contempt became, in reality, I quote, a colonial ideology favoring the supremacy of imported technology and wanting to disown any specificity to the colonized, which I take to be Dr. Raimundo's central point. Amami wrote that colonialism and neocolonialism had dissolved and disarticulated the national as it became oriented further and further away from feeding the population. The agricultural system could also no longer protect the ecology. This inheritance from the past, Amami wrote, had been slowly shrunk to the point that just some pockets and enclaves had been preserved from colonial destruction and constitute what Amami called the true national libraries of Maghrebi agricultural technology. Disarticulation and subsequent neo-colonial rearticulation also meant an ideological attack on these older forms of knowledge production. The new system, through schooling, I quote, dangled the mirage of an urban life, getting rid of centuries of prejudice and downgrading in which the rural world bathed. To modernize, he wrote, in their thinking was to erase and surpass all of the traditional systems of managing natural resources. The choice of techniques is almost never inspired by the local patrimony. And that is, he linked agricultural development in the so-called traditional mode to the preservation of the ecology, showing how the two were actually reinforcing rather than, in fact, taking the neo-dependency approach based on the Western apartheid concept of a radical separation of humanity from so-called nature. By tradition, specificity, or the local, Amami absolutely did not mean nativism. He meant merely that places are different from one another. They have different levels of precipitation, different hours of sunlight, different temperatures, different wind patterns, different soil profiles. Traditional systems meant that their repertoire of technology for managing such an ecology meant maintaining the ability to reproduce it while extracting what was needed for human well-being. He saw that specific ecologies had to be the rational basis for long-run sustainable planning. And he saw that the northern imperialist capitalist way of knowing, such as the presumption that, of course, it was wise to shift to excessively mechanized and input-intensive agriculture, had to be countered with Southern anti-colonial and national popular ways of knowing. In this way, they would distinguish and break from capitalist accumulation of value from above with a Southern accumulation of ecologically embedded use values, necessarily coming from below and from the countryside. This transformation he envisioned had two elements. One, institutional, a shift in how people learned in the engineering schools. The other, epistemological, rooted in a popular mass and implicitly peasantist and, I think, Maoist conception of technological advance and diffusion, based on valuing rather than devaluing peasant knowledge. In the first place, this meant embedding research nationally. And I quote, "In order to advantageously and effectively use the research infrastructure, every decision and technical choice of the research organisms must be condoned by them in turn, and the orientation and their technical choices would then be taken on rational bases and as a function of norms and child elaborated in Tunisia and not artificially transferred and injected." However, and also potentially, this had a class element, social liberation alongside national liberation. In the most general terms, he wrote, this meant a populist project. The Arab countries, he wrote, must encourage the promotion of a socioeconomic ecology which analyzes the rationality of local populations with a view towards injecting technological improvements corresponding to the aspirations and mutations of these populations, and not to the sophisticated and very expensive technology giving the illusion of miracle solutions. Here was a way of bridging the methodology of the laboratory with the methodology of the ethnographer, which rested on elaborating an epistemology which did not eliminate from discussion, but elevated to the dais the capacity to think of local peasants and pastoralists. He called for an interplay of knowledges in which such practices were understood to have their own rationality and were even considered, and this is the word he used, libraries. Amami did not, of course, reject technology. Both in accepting that these practices were in fact technological, he also called for technological improvement. Nor did he reject the knowledge procedures of what was called science, or what we call science. He merely insisted that local practices and the norms and dreams of populations should serve as the guidelines shaping engineering decisions about when and where to inject improvements. Thus, the place of specialists became boosters, refiners, and complements of creative national popular productive practices of the poor rural people. As he elsewhere wrote alongside his collaborator, Jean-Paul Gachet, this would entail a regional agricultural plan, decentralized and depending primarily on the mobilization of the creative will of peasants, capable of moving mountains and of defeating difficulties of all genres, and of living with droughts in order to limit the havoc that could, in this manner, such a plan could constitute a real tool of development in the rural world. Here was an argument resting on the poorest of the poor, especially Southern peasants and pastoralists from useless Tunisia, those who had supported the project that Dr. Moen was discussing of Salah Ben Yusuf, and moving in turn towards a program for national development rooted in auto-centered accumulation. It was also based on an epistemological revolution, breaking sharply with the notion of the peasantry as empty vessels for Western knowledge, which had been the calling card of Western neocolonialism in Tunisia and its native collaborators. Mahjoub, in a separate thesis, had systematized this way of thinking. He had said that the challenge of the new problematic was to find modalities and uses of technology which make possible development and the prudent management of resources and the environment. Again, far in advance of contemporary Western resurgence of interest in agroecology. This meant considering that landscape management through agriculture was actually central to national popular sustainable development. And this meant in turn considering agrarian systems as cultivated ecosystems. Furthermore, Mahjoub, in considering the relationship between capitalism and technology, asked us to consider capitalism as in essence the progressive movement of exploitation of the knowledge of the workers, and instead insisted that in the modes of production called traditional existed a fount of knowledge and a practical knowledge which must be the base, both instrumentally and also conceptually, of any development. What can we draw from these treasures, these archives of Southern dependency thinking from Tunisia? I think there are a number of central points. One, we counterpose peasant knowledge and the knowledge extant in traditional production systems against what Hutonji called intellectual dependency. We also saw peasant centrality to national popular development processes. 3, epistemology is linked to materiality. That is, what ways of knowing and ways of social reproduction were organically linked, whether in the process of the reproduction of dependency or whether in a process of rupture from dependency towards national popular development. This in turn runs against the grain of an idealist separation between thought and practice. 4, we see the agrarian question as central to the production and reproduction of dependency. And then we see the agrarian question and associated knowledges and the social subjects who were central to it as, of course, central to the project of national and popular liberation in a dependent neo-colonial country like Tunisia. So thank you very much. And I very much look forward to questions, comments, and critiques.
Thank you very much, Dr. Isle. That completes the whole story again of how education cut across all these presentations. As I could feel, education becomes a means and ends, to borrow the title of your presentation, as agriculture as means and ends of national liberation. Education becomes a tool for colonization, but with a means also of liberating us. And I have one takeaway from this paper presentations in relation to the national goal of food security. The goal of food security seems that is dependent upon the external market. Looks like as a form also of controlling local food production and distribution, actually. And in the end, food security, if not properly handled, would be a means of colonizing us. I mean, that's the whole sense I got from all these paper presentations. So for now, let's have our participants to ask questions. And by the way, I forgot to introduce myself earlier. I'm Enrique Oracion, or Ike Oracion, from Silliman University at Central Philippines. I'm a research director and a longtime member of UGAT. And my field actually is environmental anthropology. And I'm so happy about your presentations because I had been working with communities, both farming and fishing communities. And always there's the notion of food security. Question, whose security? Whose food security? Okay, anyone would like to ask questions or give some remarks, please use the raise hand button. Then you could ask if you would like to say that, or you could type it on the chat box if you would like to put me to read that. Sir Pons, you open your camera. You might want to ask the first question. Unmute, please.
Baka may gusto magtanong muna. Kung walang magtatanong, mayroon akong tanong.
Yeah, Sir Pons, lagi naman, the first, and pagkatapos yan, marami na. I give you the privilege.
Okay. Maraming salamat. Thank you for that provocative, with emphasis on the provocative presentations. Now, my take on the presentation is this, that decolonization requires some kind of epistemological clarification, which underlies some of those points on changes that are taking place in Tunisia and also in the Philippines. So we're saying that one site of epistemological struggle is the academy. So what has been the role of the academy in the social movement that is being addressed by these kinds of epistemological challenges? For instance, Tunisia was once acknowledged as the only, what do you call this, bright spot, the only, how do they term it, the only bright spot in the Arab Spring. But what happened? And what was the role of academia in terms of that process of self-determination struggle? And in the Cordillera, there was this initiative to respond to the demand for self-determination in terms of regional autonomy. What has been the role of academia in developing a kind of epistemology that somehow reconciles with local epistemologies of self-determination?
Okay, so who would like to respond to that
Yes,
first?
address to the three
Oh,
percent.
three. Okay. I-complete mo na.
I'm happy to talk to the Tunisian University dimension of the question, unless any of the other panelists would like to go first.
Go ahead, Katrina.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that excellent question. Yeah, I think that's one of the sort of several maybe paradoxes of the Tunisian revolt of 2010 to 11. Well, on the one hand, as you've mentioned, it's sort of presented as an exceptional case within the Arab uprisings because of its sort of peaceful nature, although there were several hundred people who were killed by the police and by the military in the course of the uprising. But it's sort of relatively, peaceful transition, and there's a new constitution written, elections. But many people many Tunisian activists, scholars have pointed out that despite this sort of external facade, very little actually. Firstly, there was a lot of violence. It wasn't necessarily physical violence, but there was the structural violence of neoliberalism that was accelerated in the post-revolt period. And quite a lot of external intervention, maybe not as visible as we saw in Libya or in Syria, for example, but certainly it's there in the form of international financial institutions. The Deauville Partnership, the role of the EU trying to push new free trade agreements to as a sort of counter-revolutionary tool, also the role of Gulf capital. So there is that element, which is that it wasn't as successful as it appeared to be. And as a result, and because of the Tunisian university's entanglements within these colonial capitalist structures of power, the role of international financial institutions, in particular the World Bank, has been very important in restructuring the Tunisian university as well as the EU since the 2000s, as well as even earlier. So the Tunisian university, in a way, is sort of reflective of other institutions of the state. It has yet to delink. And in part, the social movements that you had, I mean, you definitely had sort of leftist, anti-imperialist, and in that sense, some element, and I think Dr. Isle touched on this too, especially in relation to the agronomists that he discusses. There was some delinking or attempts to delink in the sort of 70s, in particular in the 60s and 70s. But there was quite a lot of repression from the government, and that led to a really restricted space. So combined with this sort of repression of the state, the intervention of international financial institutions, there hasn't been much space in the Tunisian university to develop a really decolonial project. And the post-revolt period has seen an extension of neoliberal counter-revolution rather than its end. One of the aims, of course, of the uprising itself was to delink, was to achieve an alternative development model outside of the colonial capitalist model, but that was undermined by these various interventions and the failure of the ruling elite as well to achieve that. So I would say that most of the decolonial projects that are happening today are outside of the university. And that does, there are, and I do look at the role, for example, of the leftist student union, that is very active within the university and calls for sort of material transformations, better conditions for students. There is the union, which calls for better conditions for academic laborers, but that has yet to translate into an epistemological decolonial demand, although those demands are happening outside of the university. And I think that is a really important sort of place to look for epistemological decolonial struggle, is in these other spaces, whether it's in social movements or in these food sovereignty struggles, in alternative political economy, think tanks, and that sort of thing. So that's, I think sometimes we have to, we sort of idealize the university as a space for thinking and political action, when many people have already given up on it because of how entangled it is within, imperialist knowledge systems and structures of colonial capitalism.
Could we have a perspective from the Philippines? Thank you for that, Dr. Millen.
Yeah, maybe Max.
Max first.
Yeah.
Dr. Max.
Okay. Sure. Very briefly, because Katrina covered most of the things that I would try and say. What I think is highly significant is that post 1980, the neo-colonial capitalist and imperialist sponsored counter-revolution within the Tunisian university system was, it seems to me, one of the most intensive in the Arab region. This is kind of obscured where the people focus on authoritarianisms in the states that the United States doesn't like, as opposed to one of the states the United States does like, or did historically like, which is Tunisia. I mean, you can actually find Tunisian social scientists reflecting on themselves that Ben Ali carried out an actual destruction of the Tunisian university system. He overhauled curricula. Dependency theory could no longer be taught. Developmentalist economics could no longer be taught. This kind of radical push from the 1960s reaching its peak in the 1970s and 80s, linking national popularity, linking agronomy with dependency economics, was totally just eviscerated and destroyed. So that you actually find one of a clear epistemological rupture in intellectual production, just looking at the titles of university economics dissertations starting about in 1989, 2 years after Ben Ali. You suddenly no longer can find citations to Samir Amin in economics theses. And there is a full shift to neoclassical economics and very narrow technocratic procedures of knowledge construction. Now, whatever the role of universities in struggle to be determined, right? I think it's unquestionably a bad thing that the knowledge produced in universities after that period was much less radical than what came before, right? This was a full-scale attack on autonomous knowledge production. Something Katrina knows far better than me. I just have one example that I want to lift up, rather, which is that, to my eyes, the very best study that I have read on the national liberation movement in the recent period, and especially on the radical Arab nationalist wing of the national liberation movement, came from an independent researcher who lives in Tataouine, in the Tunisian south, not, I think, affiliated with the university, is not university trained. And actually did a beautiful work with hundreds of oral histories of fighters, used a feminist approach, specifically focused on social reproduction and the role of women in the armed national movement in the South. And it's actually just a brilliant study. Clearly, the author was not necessarily trained in academic historiographical procedures and so forth. It's not like rife with such citations. It's actually a beautiful study, and it did not come from the Tunisian university system, which is still obviously struggling against the iron grip of neo-colonial procedures for knowledge production.
Yes, Sarah. Thanks for that, Dr. I.
Okay. The decolonial project involving indigenous peoples is something that has been felt strongly in the last 6 years, not just in the University of the Philippines, but in several universities and colleges in Manila. But especially in the university, what can be observed is an intergenerational cooperation of academics. The senior ones were part of the anti-dictatorship movement that actually had its roots from the anti-imperialist, anti-Cold War struggle that also began in the university in the 1950s, 1960s, that linked up with the peasant and worker struggles at the time. And with the heightened attacks on the indigenous peoples, especially in Mindanao, the Lumad Slakbayan that began in 2012 and had continued up until 2021, the middle of 2021, took shape and actually was enabled a Kampuhan sa Diliman, which was participated by Dr. Benagen also. And that's what we've been witnessing so far prior to the pandemic. So there was a broad alliance that was formed in different colleges called SOS, or basically Save Our Schools, Save the Lumad Schools, which were eventually shut down by Duterte and the Department of Education. So there is, I'm not sure whether to call it a re-emergence of say this consciousness for the struggle of the indigenous peoples for self-determination, because it's a struggle that has started long before that. But if we were to observe, for example, the knowledge production within the academy, I can speak for example, the sociological dissertations that were written from the 50s to the early 2020s. In the 50s, in the 60s, these sociological, anthropological dissertations were focused on community profiling, akin to CIA research. And then later on, this has moved on to discussing basically the cultural aspects of indigenous cultures. And then in the 70s, in the 80s, gradually you would see dissertations focusing on, say, issues of ancestral domain. And then you would have the indigenous movement, indigenizing movement within the academy, especially in the social sciences. But this particular movement would have more emphasis on what I would say it was more identitarian than focused on say economic redistribution. And I think we are still at that point that we're trying to really how do you say it, focus and assert the fact that autonomy and self-determination, just like inalienable rights, are a struggle against a dominant power and not a claim on isolation or the demand to be left alone by social, political, and economic forces. Since the indigenous has never been outside of these historical forces for us to make such a historical and distorted claims on autonomy relating to indigenous peoples. And I think Ugat and some of the works of Filipino anthropologists are really shedding light on these issues.
Thank you for that, Sarah. We have few minutes left, but there's one question here from Nikos from La Trobe University. That's Australia, I think. Yeah, that's Australia. The question is, what kind of coalition tactics and collaboration can individuals from the global south navigate in resisting the colonialist capitalist structures and the delinking with new liberal constitutions of relations of power? Well, of course, as mentioned here, Corina had somehow answered that or was answering that. Perhaps Dr. Isle and Sarah also could share some of your ideas. This is about collaborations and some coalition tactics among institutions, perhaps. Any thoughts from your end? Let's start with Max.
No, I don't have anything to add here actually. So
okay, Sarah.
Yes. Well, I think broadly speaking, we have various sectors. For example, here in the Philippines, the national minorities composing of the indigenous peoples and the LUMAD are providing us a good model for coalition politics. So in 2016, a year after the Lakbayan, where national minorities and indigenous peoples gathered in Manila and were positioned in different places, like the University of the Philippines, formed an alliance, the first of its kind, that's called Sandugo. And this is basically a coalition never before built, between and among the different tribes and the Moro, and with the goal of really fighting or struggling for the right to self-determination. And this particular alliance is also aligned with the Worker Peasant Alliance, that are and this alliance is forging the struggle for land redistribution and national industrialization through various reforms that can be clinched and won through the Parliament of the Streets, through various institutional linkages and associations with different organizations and sectors like church, students, and professionals. No? So basically, I think what is important is for tactical alliances to focus on popular issues, people's issues, as opposed to sectoral identities. I think it's hard to mobilize to forge a mass mobilization that is focused on the politics of identity. But what is important is for various sectors to come together and identify issues that affect them. No? More simply, I think that being an advocate for the right of indigenous struggle for self-determination doesn't mean that I'm just advocating for it. But for example, the sector where I belong, the education sector, also suffers from national oppression. And there are points of connections. These struggles may be different, but they are connected. For as long as we recognize that our struggles may be particular, but these particular struggles are actually generated by a system that by an imperialist system that pushes the struggles to be separate. So it's very important for us to identify tactics that are really would have a unifying character.
Oh, wow! Thank you very much for that, Sarah. That captures what's really happening in the Philippines. Our time right now is 4:59. We're supposed to end by 5 p.m. We have 1 minute, and I think I have to close this session. And I'd like to thank all the presenters. And there are some comments also in the chat box. I hope our presenters were able to read them. And of course, for the rest of the audience or our participants, you can communicate our with our presenters for other questions that you'd like to discuss further, and perhaps sharing of some notes, especially if you're doing the same kind of work. It's really very interesting in our presentation now. We have the Philippines, and then we have Tunisia, and of course across countries and across issues. But one common thing again, I'll always go back. Education becomes a tool of colonialization as well as a tool for liberation. And I love that word. It's a space of struggle.
Professor Oracion, can I just say
okay.
thank Karina Mullen for being with us. It's only 4 a.m. where she is right now.
Oh, wow.
Also, it's
Thank
too early.
you very much.
Yeah, and Max is in
Max.
Dakar also right now, so it's really early for
It's
the both
a
of them.
sacrifice. So thank you very
Thank you
much.
so much.
Thank you very much for being with us, and thanks for sharing. And it's really very, very, very interesting and very informative on how we could pursue further for a common issue. So I love that identity is out. It's the issue that's common. Okay. Anyone else would like to say something before I give you the certificate of appreciation? Okay.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to say thank you so much. This was an excellent panel. Thank you for excellent questions and your wonderful moderation.
Oh, thank you. Max, final word.
I very much appreciate my co-presenters, especially Karina, for the very early waking up. And thank you for your moderation. And thank you to the questioners as well.
Thank you. Now, I'd like to request the technical support to present the certificate on screen. Okay, I'd like to read the citation. So, Ugnayang Pang-Aghamtao Incorporated, or Anthropological Association of the Philippines, the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, Anthropological and Sociological Initiatives of Ateneo, the Institute of Philippine Culture, present this certificate of appreciation to Katrina Molin for presenting a paper titled Decolonizing Imperialist Knowledge Systems in Higher Education during the 43rd Annual Conference of the Ugnayang Pang-Aghamtao Incorporated, the Anthropologists of Decolonization and Beyond, an international conference held on December 7 to 10, 2021, online via Zoom, signed by Skelty Labastilla, UGAT President, Enrique P. Levesti, the Director of Institute of Philippine Culture, and Jose Joel P. Canuday, the Chair of the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. Corina, there's your certificate. The same certificate, the citation is presented to Sarah Raimondo with the title indicated on the certificate. Thank you very much, Ms. Sarah Raimondo, for your presentation. And the last but not the least, certificate of appreciation to Dr. Max Isle for his presentation. I got it now, Max, sorry earlier. And thank you very much. And I hope this is not the last, and we're still going to have interaction and discussion in the future when the issue of education, agriculture, and colonization, and of course, decolonization. Thank you everyone for your participation. And so this is your moderator this afternoon. I'm Ike Oracion from Silliman University. Thank you very much.
Sir, let's have a photo.
Yes, sorry. Let's have a photo ops. Please open your camera for our picture.
Yeah, very quickly, just very, very quickly. All right. Where is I'm looking for Sir Skilty. Oh, there's Sir. All right. Yeah. Okay. Everybody smile on 3. 1, 2, 3. Okay. All good po. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
The link to the evaluation form is in the chat box. Especially those who would request certificates later, we would require your evaluation. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Skilty. Right.